Hello, everyone. Welcome to this packed room. Thank you so much for choosing to join with us today. My name is Jen Hassum, and I'm the Executive Director of the Broadbent Institute. And I'd like to begin this evening in acknowledging that the Toronto Metropolitan University, where we're all gathered here tonight, is settled on the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. The Dish with One Spoon Treaty is a treaty between the Anishinaabe Mississaugas and the Haudenosaunee that bound them together to protect and share the territory and the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of friendship and respect and peace. And so that reminds us, of course, that inequality isn't accidental. It's built through relationships. It's built through existing structures of power. And tonight, we have someone who definitely is a challenger of the powerful with us to share her research, her ideas. We are going to be honoring the Ellen Meiksins Wood Lecture, Grace Blakeley. Thank you for joining us. And she'll be talking about the contention between capitalism and democracy, something that was vital and at the root of Ellen's work. This prize, of course, is established by Ed Broadbent in recognition of his partner Ellen's distinguished career in history and political theory. Her work continues to influence much that we do at the Institute and our line of thinking. Prize recipients were chosen for work that reflects Ellen's two core beliefs. One, that democracy is always fought for from below. And the second is that the egalitarian values of democracy is consistently at odds with the unequal outcomes of capitalism. So this prize includes, speaking of capitalism, this prize includes a $10,000 award and is a lecture event for Canadians to help us understand what a good society looks like and how to achieve it, how to fight for it. Next, we'll hear from TMU's Dean of Arts, Amy Peng, who will introduce our special guests. And the Broadbent Institute is just so grateful for our continued partnership with TMU and hosting the Ellen Meiksins Wood Lecture. And beyond that, our partnership is also through the Perspectives Journal internship and TMU's Democracy internship. So thank you so much to TMU for the space and for your continued partnership with us. But before bringing Dean Peng to the stage, I just want to say a few words about Grace Blakeley. I met Grace last year at a progressive governance summit in Berlin, Germany, and there I found myself moderating a panel with her. And before we'd even gotten to the second question, she was quoting Ellen Meiksins Wood's work. And I kid you not, chapter and verse, and she was demonstrating how socialism is synonymous with democracy, and that these ideas that help shape the Broadbent Institute, the left in Canada, and in fact around the world, are part of Canada's intellectual history that Ellen was a part of. So I wasn't involved in selecting this year's winner. It's not me. But I'm so grateful for the board of directors at the Institute, along with the selection committee, for recognizing Grace. And Grace Blakeley, let me tell you, she is someone who is fearless, deeply informed, and is absolutely a vital economist, researcher, and writer of our time. She challenges the assumptions of modern capitalism, and I've seen people holding the Vulture Capitalism book, and after the lecture, come on up if people are looking for signing. And she really shows us the way that corporate power sucks away our resources, whether it's our labor or the environment that is around us, or even the resources of our state. And that is, some of this really interesting and informative and vital work that Grace, you bring to us here in Canada, but also around the world. She takes on powerful interests. She will be fearlessly articulating these narratives in popular media and exposing the roots of inequality in our society. It's what makes her writing so compelling is that it is just so deeply researched and also so effortlessly articulated. And that is just such a rare and impressive feat intellectually. So thank you so much. And it's this insistence that the economy is political, number one. And number two, working class people deserve more than just the crumbs that are left at the table by the powerful. So in Canada, we're grappling with many forces. Some of the same forces that Grace has investigated so sharply: inflated prices, runaway corporate profits, the erosion of people's belief in democratic structures, and the rise of the far right. And many of these are intertwined. So we're lucky to have her tonight to help us think it through. What economic justice and what democracy looks like at this moment, at this juncture. And we're equally lucky to have Luke Savage, our good friend and writer, to be doing and leading the Q&A following the lecture. But first, I would like to welcome Dean of Arts, TMU's Dean of Arts, Amy Peng, to introduce our Ellen Meiksins Wood Lecturer, Grace Blakeley. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jen, for the wonderful introduction. Oh, good evening, everyone. So I'm Amy Peng. Conveniently, I'm a labor economist. So I'm the interim dean for the Faculty of Arts at Toronto Metropolitan University. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2025 Ellen Meiksins Wood Lecture. So this is the third year that the Faculty of Arts has hosted the event in partnership with Broadbent. We're so proud of this ongoing collaboration and honored to be part of celebrating Ellen's legacy today. And first of all, a big thank you to the Broadbent team, so the Executive Director, Jen Hassum, as well as the Director of Policy Engagement, Climate NOCOS, for your leadership and support. And then thank you all for the staff at the Broadbent, as well as in the Faculty of Arts, the Dean's Office, who worked very hard and helped to bring the event together. And in this beautiful room, beautiful sun comes out today, even though it's a bit cold. We're here today to honor Ellen Meiksins Wood, a brilliant scholar, a strong voice for democracy, and a sharp critique of capitalism. Ellen believed that democracy isn't something we can take for granted. It's something we have fought for. Her work showed us that class struggles and political actions are key to creating change. The Ellen Meiksins Wood Prize is given to people who carry that spirit forward, those who challenge power and speak out for a more just and democratic society. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce this year's prize recipients, Grace Blakeley. Grace is a staff writer at Tribute magazine. She's also the former economic commentator at the News Statement and the former research fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research. She's the leading voice in political and economic writing and is often featured in media in UK and around the world. She's written several books, including her newest one, Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and Death of Freedom. In it, she takes a hard look at how governments and corporations work together in ways that creating inequality, protect the wealthy, and weaken democracy. Vulture Capitalism was recently long-listed for the first ever Women's Prize for Nonfiction, a well-deserved recognition for her sharp analysis, rigorous research, and bold ideas. I actually went on Amazon to look at all of the reviews. It's like many 5 stars. Yeah. Grace studied at Oxford, where she earned a first-class degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, and later a master's in Africa Studies. Her work is inspired by Ellen Meiksins Wood's ideas about political Marxism and the connection between capitalism and democracy. What makes Grace's work so powerful is that she doesn't just explain what's wrong. She also challenges us to think about how we can do better and build something more just. So we're very lucky to have her tonight. Please join me now in welcoming the 2025 Ellen Meiksins Wood Lecturer, Grace Blakeley. Grace.
Hi everyone, it is so great to be here with you today in Toronto. It's so great to see so many of you here. And it is such a huge honor to be awarded the Ellen Meiksins Wood Prize. Ellen's work has had a huge impact on me. I would place my writing, my work, in the tradition of political Marxism, which is the school that Ellen really helped to found. And in particular, her understanding of the relationship between capitalism, class, and democracy have deeply informed my thinking and deeply informed my latest book, Vulture Capitalism. And in fact, I quote Ellen's work at length in the introduction to that book. I think Ellen's understanding of democracy, which was a rigorously materialist understanding of democracy, both when you're thinking about, the very first emergence of democratic institutions in Athens, which she insisted needed to be understood from a materialist perspective. We needed to be able to understand the relations of production to be able to figure out what this system meant, all the way through to her analysis of the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of capitalism, which she understood as a historically specific social formation, not an inevitability, all the way through to her understanding of modern politics and the kind of crisis of democracy today. These insights have not only informed my thinking, I think they are incredibly important in understanding what we are experiencing today, which is all across the rich world, a profound crisis of democratic institutions. And that is what I'm going to focus my lecture on today. So the most obvious case of this crisis is, of course, what we're seeing just south of Canada in the US. But this crisis of democracy is happening all over the world, particularly, when we look at Europe due to the rise of the far right, which uses explicitly anti-democratic rhetoric, which is appealing to an increasing section of the electorate. Democracy is actually losing support across the board, particularly among young people, many of whom are likely to say that they don't believe that democracy works. So what's gone wrong? There was a time when liberal democracy seemed hegemonic, seemed unchallengeable. Liberals were overjoyed at the alleged end of history in the 1990s. This was this moment of euphoria when history was literally seen as over. History is understood as it is in the liberal imaginary as a great battle between ideas. Obviously very different to the Marxist understanding of a battle between different classes. But as part of this liberal understanding of history as this great battle between ideas, the 1990s meant that history was over. Capitalism had won. Capitalism and this specific form of liberal representative democracy were seen as bedfellows. And this was where the rest of the world was going. And then all of a sudden, something changed. Support for democratic institutions, and actually most social institutions, started to ebb after the financial crisis of 2008. And liberals didn't really have a convincing explanation as to why this happened. The most common thing I hear when I'm talking to someone in the kind of liberal tradition as to why we've seen this corrosion of support for democracy is basically to blame social media. The idea being that, people are being brainwashed to dislike democracy. And I think Ellen Meiksins would disagree. I think she would have something to say about that. Because as I've mentioned, her work focused on explaining how democratic institutions emerge from a materialist perspective by analyzing the relations of production, by analyzing how productive forces shape what is going on throughout the rest of society. And I think we need that perspective now more than ever to understand why democracy is under threat. And part of the issue here is, of course, that we don't have real democracy. This is a big part of my argument in Vulture Capitalism. Vulture Capitalism is a book that argues that capitalist societies are actually characterized by a form of oligarchic centralized planning, in which public and private institutions work together to basically kind of plan who gets what. You see that with the centralized planning that takes place within large monopolistic corporations, but also the way in which powerful states work alongside those corporations to consolidate the wealth and power of those at the top. And this is completely contradictory to the way that Ellen Meiksins Wood understood democracy, which was democracy as direct popular power, a powerful force that can be used against capitalism, rather than this limited liberal representative democracy, which too often acts as its servant. So in this lecture, I want to discuss the crisis of liberal democracy and how we might build what Ellen Meiksins Wood would have seen as a genuine democracy, and all the challenges associated with that in this age of hyper-individualism. So how can we understand the current crisis of democracy from a materialist perspective? Well, the first and most obvious candidate is, of course, inequality. In the UK, a few days ago, actually, there was a study that came out showing that the UK's 50 richest families hold more wealth than 50% of the population. And this is kind of contrary to the narrative that we have about in the UK, which is that inequality is stable and it's not so much of a problem, which is obviously completely wrong. And in the US, it's similar. You have the richest 10% controlling 60% of the country's wealth. Meanwhile, poverty is on the rise. So in the UK, we have a record 4.5 million children living in poverty. And again, another stat that came out about the US the other day, 60% of families struggling to afford the essentials. Now, the reason these trends are threatening democracy is that wealth and political power are fungible. Because, as Ellen Meiksins Wood would have reminded us, there is no real separation between the economic and the political under capitalism. And this is a really crucial point, I think, to be able to understand the political Marxist critique of liberal democracy, which is that we don't live in free market democratic societies. We do live in systems of centralized capitalist planning, in which large corporations and powerful states work together to plan who gets what. Now, when this book first came out, when my book first came out, this was a more controversial point to make. Today, it seems pretty obvious when you have Elon Musk and Donald Trump working together to plan the US empire. But it's not new. This is always the way that capitalism has worked, this form of capitalist planning. It has ebbed and flowed in different ways over the years, but has been a constant feature of capitalism since its inception, all the way back to the East India Company, which was this joint venture between merchants and the British state in pursuit of imperial power. In the book, I give loads of examples of what this looks like today. So the book opens with the example of Boeing. And the 737 MAX disasters, where 2 Boeing planes crashed, killing nearly 350 people. The fact that it was later revealed that Boeing knew about the problems with these planes before they went to market and allowed them to go to market anyway. And the central role of the American state in supporting this company before this crisis, through the crisis, and then after the crisis, showing those intimate links between corporations driven by this pursuit of wealth at all costs and capitalist states driven by a desire to shore up their own wealth and power, and doing so by cooperating with elites and vested interests. I also use some Canadian examples in the book. Particularly, there's a very close relationship, as some of you might know, between one of the world's largest asset managers, BlackRock, and the Canadian state. And now something that Luke, I know, is very familiar with. And now you have our former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, leading this country. These links between the public and private sector, mediated by institutions like central banks, are critical to the way that capitalism functions. And it goes against, I think, the popular understanding of the divide between left and right as this divide between markets and states. And this is what I think Marxists really can bring to our politics, is a recognition and understanding that these two forces are not at odds, that they are in fact working together as part of a capitalist system to consolidate this inequality of power that defines capitalism. What defines capitalism not being free market democracy, but what defines capitalism being a divide between the people who own all the stuff and everyone else who is forced to work for a living, and the organization of society in the interests of the former. So this close cooperation between corporate interests, wealthy individuals, and states shapes very deeply how liberal democracy functions. And this is a big part of the crisis that we're dealing with today. But this isn't the end of the story. As I've illustrated, this cooperation has always existed. This has always been the case. So why is it becoming so much more of an issue now? Why is this crisis of inequality having such a deep and profound impact on our democratic institutions? So first, we're living through a period of kind of low productivity, combined with a series of economic and political crises that have meant that there's less to go around. So more at the top means less for everyone else. The rise of this kind of zero-sum politics of the kind practiced by Trump. So if there's more for me, that means less for you. That's the antithesis of the kind of 90s liberal triumphalist end of history moment of we don't need to kind of fiddle around with the balance of power between different classes because we can just wait for growth and then everything else will follow. This was really what collapsed during the financial crisis of 2008. It's what's collapsed even further during the cost of living crisis. You know, inflation being one of those really critical trends that enforces this zero-sum mindset of more for you means less for me. Inflation is one of those things that really brings out class conflict because, you know, who pays for inflation is something that is basically often decided, has historically been decided on the streets as part of this battle between workers and bosses. So the rise of this zero-sum politics is really undermining the foundations of that liberal democratic moment, which was based on the idea that growth would basically smooth over that contradiction between workers and bosses. Second, globalization has meant that these inequalities are becoming concentrated in particular places, which means that they have an outsized impact on our politics as they can be effectively leveraged to shift political outcomes. We all know what this looks like in the rise of, you know, the liberal metropolitan elite discourse that divides peripheries from the centers of our countries. It gave rise to Brexit, for example, the idea of people in left-behind communities giving a bloody nose to the liberal establishment. This is something that we're also seeing in the US and in many other parts of the world. But the final reason that inequality is now creating such a profound crisis for our democratic institutions, and the one that I want to focus on, is that we live in an age of individualism, which makes people feel powerless to challenge those at the top. And there's a story that I want to tell you, something that I experienced a few years ago that I think illustrates actually all of these points. So back in 2019, some of you may know I was fairly integrally involved in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. And back in 2019, when one of these elections was taking place, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, I was knocking on doors in these kind of left-behind regions of the UK. I was in a former mining town, speaking to voters, asking them how they would be voting. And I knocked on one particular door, and the occupant kind of opened it slightly suspiciously. And I asked him if he knew how he'd be voting in the upcoming election. And he said, no, he didn't know. Lots of people didn't make their mind up until the last possible moment. So I asked him, you know, what are the issues that you are most concerned about? And he said, well, I'm particularly concerned about the economy. So I was like, great, I'm a, you know, policy wonk. I can answer all of your questions about the economic policies in the manifesto. So I listed these policies. And then he comes back looking at me again very suspiciously. How are you going to pay for all that? So I listed that this was a fully costed manifesto and there would be taxes on the wealthy and there would be investment that would create growth, et cetera, et cetera. And his answer really stuck with me, his response to that point. He basically said, I've voted Labour my whole life and they've been in power here for years. So Labour had been in local government in that area for years. They promised the world at election time and nothing changes. And I didn't really know how to respond because the Marxist in me was like, yeah, you're right. That is a pretty accurate description of how liberal politics works. And we know why this is from a theoretical perspective. You know, I write all about this in Vulture Capitalism. The capitalist state is, like capital, a social relation. So policy outcomes reflect the balance of class power in society. You know, we've seen this very, very clearly with the most recent Labour government to be elected in the UK. There's a great, really clear example of, I think, how vested interests shaping the policy process has worked, which is that Rachel Reeves promised to come in and deliver a big tax on private equity. You know, this is a great populist policy. These are some of the wealthiest institutions, most powerful institutions in the finance sector. And it would have been a really easy tax that would have affected a very small number of people. And what happened? The private equity industry extremely successfully lobbied to water down these proposals beyond recognition, such that a tax that would have affected a few thousand people ended up being not scrapped, but watered down so substantially that it became unrecognizable. So, you know, we know how this works. I've written extensively about how this works. But that isn't really helpful when you're on the doorstep talking to people about why they should not necessarily just vote for a political party, why they should get engaged in politics at all. I thought a lot about this interaction afterwards, about what this man was feeling and about what the implications were for our politics. And the thing I concluded was that all of his responses could be traced back to a profound sense of powerlessness. Like nothing could ever change, certainly not in the way that this man wanted things to change. This came through in the question, how are you going to pay for it? You know, this was less a question about the kind of intricacies of fiscal policy, and it was more a question about credibility. Why should I believe you that you can do anything good? All the way through to the idea that politicians are all the same. Things for people like me don't tend to change. I think you'll recognize aspects of this story because it's an experience that has been replicated all over the developed world, of places being left behind, of communities being hollowed out, people feeling powerless to arrest those changes, all the way through to the horrifying rise in what some sociologists have called deaths of despair, suicide, alcoholism, that are concentrated in these communities. This issue of powerlessness, I would say, is the defining political emotion of our age. And the far right is beating us in the response. Why? Well, there are two ways that you can respond to powerlessness. And I think, different sides of the political spectrum take these different responses, respectively. There's despair, right? You can say, oh, well, I'm powerless to change things. The world is the way it is. There's nothing I can do about it. I think a lot of people on the left often end up taking this route. I see this extensively among young people today, particularly when it comes to how they take on the climate crisis. Ultimately, it can lead to conspiracism, because conspiracism is a kind of, inverted response to this feeling of those at the top are in complete and utter control, and there's nothing I personally can do about it. There's nothing I can really do to challenge them. But the other way to respond to feelings of powerlessness is anger. People thrash and rage against the constraints imposed upon them and desperately attempt to regain some sense of agency, some sense of power. And often, they regain this sense of political agency by projecting it onto a powerful ruler who promises to come in and bash the political elites who have crushed them and ignored them and undermined them for so long. Thinking about this, response to powerlessness, this rage in response to powerlessness that the far right has capitalized on so effectively, it made me think about the emergence of fascism in Italy. The word comes from this tool that was developed by the Romans, the fasces, which is a bundle of sticks with an axe in the middle. And Mussolini picked up this symbolism. Mussolini, a former socialist, picked up this symbolism. The reason that the fasces is used is because a single stick is very easy to break. But when you bind a bunch of sticks together, they become very difficult to break. When you stick an axe in the middle, they can be used to attack your political enemies. I don't think that it's a coincidence that this bears some similarity to the historic symbol of the trade union movement, which is a raised fist. Because you can break one finger quite easily, but you can't break a raised fist. And this, I think, is a really important point to understand the rise of fascism in the context of powerlessness, both today and historically. Because in an age when people recognize and realize the coordinated, pervasive power of our political economic elites, but they feel isolated to do anything about it. They feel like that one stick or that one finger. Then a message that says, if you come together, you can be powerful, is very compelling. And the tragedy is that that message, which was historically put forward by the left as part of the labor movement, has been lost, but the right are doing that very effectively. They're saying you need to come together to defend your communities against outsiders. And often there are overtones or undertones of political violence as a part of that. This, I think, is the main issue threatening democracy today. It's not just inequality, it's inequality in the context of the decline of collective power and the rise of individualism. And this, I think, can be traced back, again, to neoliberalism, something that you may ordinarily associate with changes in economic policy. There was a much more profound and deep project that was at the heart of the neoliberal movement. And it comes through in the quote from Margaret Thatcher when she says, there's no such thing as society. This wasn't an observation of the society that she found in the 1970s in Britain. That was a statement of intent. One of the most important parts of the neoliberal revolution was breaking up the collective institutions that gave people that sense of community, of power, of solidarity in an economy that was weighted against them, that allowed people to shift the balance of power within society, and so to make politicians pay attention to them, to create those changes within the state in their favor. This was Thatcher taking on the miners. It was Reagan taking on the aircraft traffic controllers. But it was also globalization, leading to hollowed out places where there were once thriving communities that could allow people to engage in political projects. It was the centralization of state power, somewhat ironically for a neoliberal movement that claimed to abhor the state, as I show in Vulture Capitalism. That is very, very far from the truth. Laws against protest, against striking. I think Ellen captured this really effectively with a quote, which is that for all intents and purposes, there is no politics, or at least no legitimate politics, outside Parliament. Indeed, the more inclusive the people has become, the more the dominant political ideologies have insisted on depoliticizing the world outside Parliament and delegitimizing extra-parliamentary politics. Now, this neoliberal attempt to really eviscerate those collective institutions that gave people a sense of belonging, solidarity, power, this was a response to a very particular political moment. There's a French sociologist called Grégoire Chamaillou who wrote a book called The Ungovernable Society. And he observed that in the 1970s, all across the rich world, there was this moment of extraordinary confidence among the working classes. Now, this was obvious in the labor movement, where you had, in the UK, workers coming together to effectively shut down production in this struggle over who was going to be made to pay for inflation. But it was also visible throughout the whole of society. It was visible in the anti-apartheid movement, in the peace movement, in the movements of '68 across Europe. There was this sense that those at the top were losing control. And this is, I think, really critical to understanding how capitalism works. The neoliberals had this narrative, which is that capitalism is a free market system, and we want to reduce the size of the state to create more space for the market. But the way that they actually behaved, which had very little to do with creating free markets, and if you look in the economic sphere, it's actually much more to do with subsidizing vested interest. But in the realm of society, their project was really to take down these forms of collective power and create an ideology of the market that encouraged us to believe that we all had to compete against one another to get to the top. I really take down in the book the neoliberal ideology that says we want to create free market systems by showing that most of their policy proposals did anything but. They actually ended up creating forms of kind of corporate corruption and centralization that were antithetical to the original ideas of people like, for example, Hayek. But the ideology of the market, the idea that society should be made to resemble a market system in which you couldn't have forms of collective organizing because that would undermine the functioning of the market, which requires us all to see ourselves as these isolated, atomized individuals competing against one another to get to the top. And if you do get to the top, it's because you are a high-value individual. If you don't get to the top, it's because you are a low-value individual. Don't blame the system, blame yourself. And this was an ideology that was really, pushed in a number of different ways. There was the obvious use of force. So Thatcher literally sending the police against striking miners. But there were much more subtle ways in which this ideology was pushed. We stopped referring to workers. Workers instead were understood as mini entrepreneurs. This was really epitomized. It reached its apogee with the rise of the gig economy, right? Where you are no longer an employee of Uber. You are a little firm. You buy your own inputs and outputs. But it was also evident in the kind of neoliberalization of education, where you have your individual human capital. And it's okay for you to take out a loan to invest in your education because you are going to reap the long-term returns from that investment in your human capital over the long run. You are not a worker, you are a small business. And everyone in that sense is drawn in to the capitalist system because your fate as an entrepreneur is, in some senses, tied to the performance of financial markets. And this is, again, epitomized by the creation of home-owning democracies and the privatization of pensions, so that you as a worker, your fate is tied to the ups and downs of capital markets. And you can be encouraged and convinced not to come together with other workers to demand increases in your wages, but instead to compete with those around you and to understand the performance of your portfolio as a representation of your effectiveness as a little entrepreneur. Workers became entrepreneurs. Citizens were no longer understood as citizens participating in a public sphere. They came to be understood as consumers of public services. And the median voter would attempt to maximize their utility by voting for the political party whose policy program most neatly represented their interests and preferences. And in that sense, you had the technocratization of politics, the loss of the sense of politics as a struggle between different interest groups, and instead the rise of this form of politics that I think someone like Mark Carney really epitomizes, which is the idea that it is a choice between different policies that can basically be assessed through the discipline of economics to determine which policy is the best. And it just so happens that the best policies tend to be the ones that actually work in the interests of those at the top. Citizens become consumer of public services. Communities, instead of being represented as communities, become isolated households. There was a whole movement within neoliberal economics to say that failing places should be allowed to fail, and those resources should be more effectively redistributed to allow for the proper, efficient functioning of markets across geographical places. And instead of these thriving communities, which were the foundations in many places of the labor movement, you have isolated individual households that learn to compete against one another to survive. And today we are so busy competing with each other that we have forgotten how to work together to change the rules. And that is why we all feel so powerless. And I think this is a real shift. This represents a real challenge because it's a real shift from how society looked when the left first emerged. You know, the workers coming together to form the first unions and fight for their right to organize and fight for democracy itself. They faced objectively far greater challenges than we do today, but they had a sense of their ability to work together to change things. And that's what we lost in the 1980s. So how can we fight back? Well, as Ellen Meiksins Wood would have argued, we need real democracy. And as I would argue, you cannot have real democracy in an individualistic society where rather than collective power, people see themselves as competing with one another in order to get to the top of a rigged economy. The only way to really change things is to shatter individualism as an ideology, as a practice, as a set of structures, and figure out how we can work together again. Stop asking, what can I do? And start asking, what can we do? Our job on the left isn't just to explain why capitalism isn't working. I can give complex theoretical explanations of the links between public and private power under capitalism. But what I found when talking about this book with normal people is that most people already know this. They know that big businesses are in bed with government. That's basically what the guy was telling me on the doorstep all those years ago. They don't need us to explain why. The issue is that they feel powerless to change things. Why? Because you can't change things on your own. And that is how people feel, completely on their own. The reason that I started investigating these problems around individualism and isolation and powerlessness is because when I was going around promoting vulture capitalism, I spoke to a lot of young people, and they would be really enthused by the ideas that I was talking about in the book, and particularly the final section where I discuss these examples of kind of democratic planning at the grassroots level, because their worldview is so shaped by individualism that the idea of coming together to build different ways of living, to challenge the power of capital, is so alien to them. They're used to going to talks, book talks about politics, and the end point is a list of policies that could be implemented, or even worse, a set of consumption decisions that you can make to be a good ethical consumer that isn't directly contributing to the issues that we've talked about. So I think this challenge of individualism has become so rooted, particularly in the minds of young people who've never really lived without it. And it's also why there is this profound sense of isolation. And all the young people, particularly, Gen Z people who I've spoken to, who have begun to participate in forms of collective organizing that have brought them together with other like-minded people, whether that's as part of a union, whether it's as part of a protest movement, or, a climate movement, or anything. The one thing that they speak about, the thing that they all have in common, is yes, this sense of collective joy, but also the need that they didn't realize they had for connection and belonging that is met through participation in these social institutions. And that's really why I think today the job of the left has to be to help us to rebuild those forms of collective power. Now, there was a time when this was kind of, these forms of collective organizing that were taking place on the grassroots were dismissed as folk politics. And there was this shift on the left to say, look, we need to refocus on institutions. And I think that was important. It was right. It was the foundations for what we saw in the 2010s of the rise of leftist movements in which I was involved. But those institutionalist projects all failed because they didn't have that base that could shift the balance of power in society to build power. If the left wants to influence political institutions, we need to be able to understand this idea of the state as a social relation, this Marxist idea that can be traced back through someone like Ellen Meiksins Wood, but also Ralph Miliband, all the way back to Gramsci, and say, how do we build popular power in order to allow people to take back control over their lives so that they can become engaged in these forms of politics? And I think this actually requires a shift in our own ways of thinking about politics, because I think there's a sense in which we have absorbed an individualistic approach to politics. I see this a lot of people on the left seeing ourselves as heroes, saving victims. I think this is what that man who I spoke to on the doorstep was really cynical about, because it feeds into a lack of agency. If you approach someone and say, I'm here to save you, that feeds into that very sense of powerlessness. This is at the root of their political alienation to begin with. So I think this is the challenge that we face today. We need to abandon the politics of hero and victims and start empowering working people to, in the words of the Brexiteers, take back control of their own lives. And if you think about it, this is the only way that the left has ever won political change in the past. Left politics did not emerge from clever leftist intellectuals going to working class communities and saying, have you considered forming a union to shift the balance of power away from capital and towards labor? No, left politics emerged out of people's struggles for a better life. Instead of pushing some policy agenda that can be implemented by elites, we need to empower people to take control from the bottom up. Not because we don't want to take control of political institutions, but precisely because we do. And I think our understanding of our mission needs to change. Instead of slogans like tax the rich or Green New Deal now, which, by the way, I'm entirely in favor of, but how is someone who's hearing that message going to respond? How do I engage with a political project whose mission is basically a set of policies that's going to be implemented by elites? And instead, I think we need to focus as well on empowering people to take control in their communities, in their workplaces, and on the streets. I think we need to be reminding people that political change isn't something that is going to be delivered from the outside, that that's not how democracy, as people like Ellen Meiksins Wood understood it, works. It's going to come from their efforts to change their own lives. And our slogan, I think, has to change. It has to look something along the lines of organize, because nobody is coming to save us. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. That was wonderful. Really, really enjoyed the talk. There are so many different potential threads to pull. I guess I should say first how this is going to work. I think we've got about 45 minutes, something like that. So Grace and I are going to have a short discussion. I'm going to ask her 2 or 3 questions, maybe 4. We'll see where it goes. And then all of you will have a chance to ask questions, and I believe there will be folks going around with microphones to facilitate that. Although, as I understand it, I have the conch, and I will be the one actually pointing. I think that's how it's going to work. So where should we begin? I mean, on my way over here, I took the TTC here, doing my part as a consumer of public services. And I saw an ad. I don't know what the ad was for. It might have been cryptocurrency. It might have been a tax-free savings account. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But the ad said, you're not buying a home. You're buying the freedom to be as loud as you want. Reward yourself. And, again, it doesn't really matter what the ad is about, but having, just spent part of the afternoon diving back into your book, I had my They Live glasses on, and, looking at that ad, it struck me that this really reflects one of the foundational myths of neoliberal capitalism, that, the story it's telling us is really fundamentally a story about freedom. And I was very interested in the way that in vulture capitalism you put such a specific emphasis on freedom. The phrase "the death of freedom" appears in the subtitle. And the subtitle is corporate crimes, backdoor bailouts, and the death of freedom. So I guess just to begin by lobbing a bit of a softball, I mean, why the particular emphasis on freedom? Why is that in the subtitle as opposed to, equality, democracy, anything else like that?
This was really an attempt to rescue, I think, the original understanding of socialism and the understanding of socialism that people like Marx and his contemporaries would have had from the immense weight of Keynesianism and corporatism and, dare I say it, social democracy. Because I think the understanding of socialism that most of us have today is the legacy of that time period of the Keynesian social democratic consensus, which obviously aligns with this period where you have the Cold War, you have state centralized, planned socialism on the one hand, and lovely free market democracy on the other hand. And that was very much linked with this Keynesian view of the world, which is that, the job of a kind of social democratic politics is to contain the irrationalities of capitalism and to do so through state planning, basically. And the alignment that then emerged between liberals who adopted this Keynesian approach with the labor movement that recognized that this approach presented a lot of opportunities for them in terms of demand management, in terms of investment, in terms of a new role for the state. Now, this was critically important in delivering pretty much all of the gains that we now take for granted that the left has delivered. But what I was speaking about in that speech, about that kind of crisis of ungovernability that took place in the 1970s, that was an inevitable result of the contradictions of that particular political model. So that social democratic model, it was a corporatist model, and I mean that in the sense of it relied on a role for the state that involved mediating between labor and capital. So in some cases, in the US, you actually had, and I wrote about this in the book, something called the Tripartite Commission, which brought together representatives of the labor movement with CEOs, with representatives of politicians, and they would kind of debate and discuss how policy should be made. That was the kind of social foundation for this particular period, and it worked for as long as you had this a kind of astonishing post-war growth miracle, the spread of globalization, the opening up of new markets, and a growing economy that could feed this non-zero-sum politics. So workers getting wealthier and bosses getting wealthier as well. And there was this critique of this model from the left, which was like, this is going to defang socialism. This is going to defang workers. It's going to make them not really care about radical politics anymore and kind of absorb them into the system. What actually happened was the opposite. So by the time you get to the 1970s, this period of relative prosperity and a participation of workers in various forms of political decision-making, which happened, by the way, all around the world, not just in the US. This empowered workers. It's the opposite of the situation we have today. People felt like, no, I have been participating in forms of political governance, basically. I've been negotiating with bosses. In some cases, and I write about this in the book, workers actually ended up taking control of decision-making processes within the firm. And this is actually, incidentally, why the Tripartite Commission broke down in the US. It's because workers said, we want to be able to have an influence over the investment decisions that businesses are making. We want to be able to influence how automation is, for example, rolled out. And the CEOs said, no, that is contravening the actual role of capital, which is to manage and govern and control labor. And you can't cross that Rubicon. So this was what the 1970s was all about. It was this challenge of, by workers to these kind of authoritarian hierarchical systems that had been introduced, that are integral to the way that capitalism works, but that had actually been maintained throughout that social democratic period. And it was the sense of workers saying, it's not enough for us to have a capitalist economy that is managed somewhat more in our interests. We want the freedom to be able to shape the conditions of our own existence. And the example that I talk about in the book is the Lucas Plan, where basically what the workers in this kind of failing aerospace company, Lucas Aerospace, were encouraged by the then Minister for Trade, Tony Benn, one of my personal heroes, to put together a plan to show how they could take over this failing firm and run it as a kind of democratic workers' cooperative. And this, rather than the kind of Keynesian demand management that was the hallmark of the social democratic period, this was the line that capital could not be allowed to cross. This was what the crisis of ungovernability was about. It was about people having been so empowered by this experience of social democracy that they started to say, why do we need bosses? Why do we need politicians to make decisions on our behalf? Why can't we run these institutions ourselves? And that was what the neoliberal turn was really about challenging. It wasn't about free markets or shrinking the state. It was about reasserting the authority of the ruling class over everyone else. And this is why I think this understanding of freedom is really, really important. Rather than just equality, which again was much more the hallmark of Keynesianism, because to really threaten capitalist social relations, it's not enough to say, we're going to have a state that mediates between labor and capital. You have to really be thinking about challenging the hierarchy that makes capitalism function. The fact that those at the top decide how our resources are used and everyone else is forced to obey. So this understanding of freedom, and again, I wanted to trace that back to the original socialists and actually to Marx himself, to kind of recover that original understanding of freedom. And the quotes I use, and I contrast Marx with Hayek. Hayek obviously being this neoliberal theorist who makes freedom his whole thing. His book, The Road to Serfdom, is about how social democracy inevitably leads us away from freedom. And the quote I pull out at the beginning of the book from Hayek is that freedom of thought will only ever be of relevance to a small minority, i.e. most people are too stupid really to participate in the decision-making processes that allow society to be governed. And I contrast that with a quote from Marx, which is a famous quote. It's a quote that inspired the architects of the Lucas Plan, called The Architect and the Bee. And Marx basically says, a spider is astonishingly capable of producing these really intricate structures. Bees are able to produce these beautiful hives that would be beyond the reach of many human architects. But the difference between the architect and the bee is that the architect designs his structures in his head before bringing them to life with his hands. And what he's saying there is something that is integral to human nature, is the capacity for creativity, for imagination, and for working together to create not just physical structures, but social and collective structures that can allow us to organize our lives together. And that, I think, is an understanding of socialism that is rooted in the Marxist tradition and that was lost because of the immense weight of this Keynesian understanding, which was like, no, left politics is just about managing capitalism. Whereas for me, socialist politics is about putting the people who produce the value in charge of the decisions. And that is, I think, the socialist understanding of freedom.
Okay, yeah, there are so many threads, potential threads to pull there. I mean, I guess you've alluded to it already, but I think because it's so fundamental to the arguments you make in the book and the arguments you put forth in your lecture, I think it's worth zeroing in on. I think one of the many useful things your book does is it really deconstructs this this dichotomy that is often, integral to a lot of mainstream economics discourse. I think, frankly, parts of the left have sort of absorbed this as well. The idea that there's a sort of a hard barrier, a hard distinction to be made, a concrete distinction between free markets on the one hand and central planning, command economies on the other. You really argue quite persuasively that that's, the distinction is an illusory one, right? There's planning everywhere. It's just a question of, what's the planning, what are the objectives of the planning and whose interest is the planning being done? And something else the book does that I think's really useful, and this is what I'd like to ask you about, is you have all these concrete examples around economic and industrial democracy. There's the Lucas Aerospace case involving Tony Benn that you mentioned. There are examples in sort of big and small, local and national in places like Iceland, Spain. Chile, and I guess the one that fascinated me the most was the example you gave in Chile, where the Allende government actually incorporated technologies and techniques from both Soviet planners and also from US market planners as well. And I want to bring this up because I think sometimes in debates about economic and industrial democracy, this can seem very abstract, you know, because we haven't really lived it, we haven't really seen it. It wasn't it didn't become a big part of the Keynesian settlement for the reasons you just said. So yeah, I'm not really sure how to formulate this as a question, but perhaps you can talk about some of these concrete examples and maybe give us a sense of how industrial democracy has worked in practice.
Yeah, so those two threads that you highlighted about these questions around planning under capitalism, and then the examples of where forms of kind of democratic planning have been implemented, are I think really linked, and they're close to the reason that I wanted to write the book. And in the introduction to the book, I say that one of the kind of central questions of vulture capitalism is, what if we were to take Hayek seriously? Now, Hayek had this critique of social democracy, which was rooted in complexity theory and systems theory, which was to say that this system of the market economy is an extraordinary kind of calculating machine that's able to take vast amounts of information and spit out through this extraordinary process, spit out these things, prices that allow us to so effectively manage the production and allocation of society's resources that there is no way that any central authority could do that. You know, it has to be this kind of decentralized market system that is at the center of kind of processing this information, because we're dealing with complexity. We're not dealing with a system that can be planned, because it's so complex. There are so many inputs, so many outputs. Any planner would basically mess it up, right? And I think it's an important argument, because our societies, our economies, they are complex systems. And when you do try to centrally plan them, you do get all sorts of inefficiencies, all sorts of problems, all sorts of kind of issues around corruption. But the issue is that capitalist societies have all of those problems that Hayek claimed were limited to social democratic systems. Now, you see this most clearly in the case of capitalist corporations, which do not function internally like markets. They function like giant planning machines, where you have a couple of guys, and they generally are guys, at the top of these corporations saying, this is what we're going to do. This is the path that we're going to go down. This is what we're going to produce. Now, someone like Hayek would say, yes, but they are subject to the pressures of the market. So they can't just do anything they like, because the market would come in and say, okay, well, your profits are lower, which means you're doing something wrong, so you're going to have to change course. But that is not the case for the commanding heights of our economy, because these institutions tend to be large monopolistic corporations that are more or less insulated from the pressures of market competition. So firms like, for example, Amazon, which were not profitable for a significant period of time, could go against the market, and in doing so, could build forms of political and economic power that actively works to undermine the market even further. You know, and Amazon can go 14 years without making profits, instead just expanding and expanding and expanding, increasing its empire, getting politicians to be part of its network, acquiring assets. That is the opposite of the kind of Hayekian dream of decentralized market relations. It is a form of centralized planning. And if you look at all of the kind of biggest and most important sectors of our economy, they are characterized by this form of kind of concentration, what Marx called concentration and centralization, of a small number of very powerful institutions basically being able to control who gets what. And it doesn't even stop there, because not only are they able to kind of control what goes on within the market, they then use that power to shape what happens within politics, to shape the environment, to shape, social relationships much more broadly. They project their power across the world through imperialism. They work with financial institutions, and the finance sector is, in fact, one of the best and most powerful examples of how capitalist planning works today. So this really kind of undermines the Hayekian argument that capitalism is this beautiful kind of free market complex system, and instead shows that, as I argue, it is characterized by pervasive forms of planning. So then, the socialist response has to take that into account, Because, historically, there has been a certain portion of the socialist and Marxist left that basically just says capitalism is irrational, it creates crises, so we need to find ways of being able to plan systems of production more effectively to deliver us from the problems of crisis. And actually, the fact that you have planning within capitalist systems, planning that works in certain people's interests rather than others, suggests that the market versus planning dichotomy is not really the kind of core of the divide between capitalism and socialism. And it links back to the argument that I made in response to the last question. What characterizes capitalism is the authority of capital, basically, over everyone else. This is a political relationship as much as an economic one. It is about their ability to, yes, control the means of production, which means that everyone else is forced to live in a world that is shaped by those social relationships, but also to shape our conditions of existence in so many different ways. The neoliberal idea that we want freedom has basically been boiled down to freedom, the freedom that we have as consumers. So we can go into a supermarket and pick between a bunch of different items on the shelves, except when you turn those items to the back, you see that they're all owned by like 3 companies, and you realize that you even have the illusion of consumer choice. And not only that, but even those, the decisions that take place before you've entered the supermarket have been taken again by someone else somewhere else. So you have this illusion of choice, this illusion of freedom that is completely antithetical to, what someone like Hayek would have claimed is at the core of capitalism. So if that is the case, and the antithesis of a capitalist economy, of a market economy, is not a centrally planned economy, then what is it? And I think these questions of authority are really important, because a capitalist system, again, relies on this idea, and you see this replicated throughout much of our political discourse today, that there are certain people who are destined to rule, to be in charge. Historically in conservative thought, that has been the aristocracy. Today, in modern liberal political thought, it's the economists, because they're able to tell us...
Teeing up the next question perfectly, by the way.
They can tell us the precise, correct policies. They can tell us the optimal rate of corporation tax. They're the kind of modern oracles that can instruct us about how we manage the economy. And for me, the opposite of that isn't like a different group of central planners. It is democratic planning of the kind that we saw at the very, very early stages in Chile. I'm not going to tell the whole story of Cybus in here because we don't have time, but I write about it in the book, about this democratic socialist leader coming to power in Chile and basically forging a path between the centralized planning that was practiced in the USSR and the market system that was practiced in the US, and pushing this democratic socialist agenda, attempting to create networks of production that relied on cooperation between workers and politicians and citizens, using very, very limited technology, using literally telex machines that were available to him, and how deeply, deeply threatening this project was to American interests. Because this was a real alternative. This involved actually empowering working people. And ultimately, of course, they got cooed by America and it failed, as happens time and time again. But it showed us the possibilities that exist in this idea of kind of democratic planning, of people working together to design systems themselves, of being architects of their lives, of their societies, of actually having real freedom.
So I guess just one more quick question before we turn to questions from all of you. But yeah, since he's come up a number of times in your talk, come up a number of times this evening, I did want to kind of ask my last question about a distinguished public servant who's distinguished himself both in this country and in yours, namely our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. I guess as a Canadian talking to a Brit, I'm curious about what exactly is Carney's kind of reputation in the UK. I feel here in Canada, if you're Canadian and you sort of distinguish yourself abroad, really in any capacity, that's kind of very bankable here. No pun intended, but it is. So I feel like Carney's reception here, the way he's understood, is almost through kind of this foreign lens, like, oh, he's made it abroad, he's done it abroad, so now he's going to come here and he's going to, I don't know, fix all our problems by turning the federal government over to BlackRock or something. But Carney was governor of the Bank of England, and what can you tell us about his role there, and what's your impression of kind of Carneyism as a political project based on his tenure at the Bank of England?
Carney was a very popular central banker amongst our political class. And I think that's because he represents he is the kind of arch technocrat, right? He in some ways represents the politics that I was talking about, which is this triumphalist end of history moment of there are no more big battles to be waged between different social groups. There are no big battles to be waged between different ideas of the good. There is only optimization. There is only the management and the tweaking of different policy levers to deliver the best possible outcome, to deliver the maximal possible utility for each different market participant in our society. And this is a very seductive vision of the world that has become totally dominant in the realm of academic economics, is rooted in a particular understanding of, society and sociology, which is again based on individualism. So the idea of society as this kind of market system based on individual entrepreneurs competing against one another to get to the top, and is completely and utterly counterposed to kind of collectivist forms of understanding political power. And technocracy, that this kind of technocratic politics really died a death in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. I was kind of mentioning this in the talk, that the foundation of that triumphalist moment was basically a bubble in financial markets leading up to 2008, which allowed people to believe that the end of history had really come about because we did not need to have struggles between different groups with different interests. That actually we all had the same interest, which was just in economic growth, increasing the size of the pie, a rising tide lifting all boats, and that, technocrats like someone like Mark Carney would be able to kind of manage technical areas of policy to make sure that that expansion continued. And this was a moment of kind of hubris for liberal political elites, epitomized by someone like Gordon Brown saying, thanks to independent central banking, we have reached the end of boom and bust, literally just like moments before the financial crisis of 2008. And it was very, very seductive, but it started to fall apart, obviously, when it became clear that we had not reached the end of boom and bust. And it even started to fall apart when Mark Carney was leading the Bank of England. Because I think, the death of this technocratic model of governance it basically fell apart on its own terms. And it fell apart on its own terms thanks to something that you might be familiar with, thanks to a policy called quantitative easing, central bank asset purchases, right? And I'm not going to go too deeply into this because it's a bit nerdy, but basically the idea behind making central banks independent and giving people like Mark Carney so much power over the economy was that their decisions would have no redistributive implications, or if they did, then they would be limited. That the primary focus was basically effective management of the economy with a view to maximizing efficiency, and the impact of policies like changing, for example, the interest rate on different social groups was at best a secondary issue. And that meant that because this wasn't, these questions weren't questions about different social groups with different interests, that they could be removed from politics altogether. That instead of having different groups fighting for their idea of the good, you would instead have a technocrat making decisions for everyone else and saying, look, if we put interest rates at this level, then it will bring in line, it would lead to inflation being below this level, or it will align employment and inflation in such a way that we think is going to kind of maximize efficiency over the long run. And this really fell apart after the financial crisis when those traditional tools of monetary policy started to break down. And instead, we saw central bankers saying, right, to revive economic growth, we're going to need to use our power to start purchasing assets. This started with government debt and eventually expanded to lots of other areas of the economy. And this policy had profound redistributive implications. Something like the financial crisis of 2008, it should have destroyed vast amounts of wealth. It should have been this kind of Schumpeterian form of creative destruction where, you know, financial institutions go under, businesses go under, and things are reset so that the bubble can start again. But instead, governments and then central banks rode to the rescue of those at the top, of first banks and then asset holders through quantitative easing. And the implications of their policies, and particularly central bank asset purchases, were to dramatically increase wealth inequality, because basically they stepped in to purchase assets which otherwise would have seen much greater falls in their value after a big financial crisis and didn't. And that was a real kind of existential crisis for this model of central bank policymaking, because it was very difficult after that point to deny that what central bankers were doing affected the balance of power in society, affected politics, affected inequality. And someone like Mark Carney would never have admitted that, and would always have said that, no, we're just doing technical interventions to kind of fix the way that the economy works. And I basically think that's the foundation of Carneyism, right? It is a project that is designed to protect the interests of those at the top, disguised in a technical language of economics that really obscures the power relations that feed into this. And so that means I think you've got to be really careful in dealing with a project like this, because it's really kind of very difficult to fight it in the realm of technical debate, which is often what our politics is limited to. And instead, you really have to expose who is benefiting from these decisions. You have to be able to expose the fact that, you know, BlackRock is invited in to manage the way that the Canadian state works. You have to expose the vested interests of, you know, for example, the real estate sector and how those are impacting the housing crisis, affordability, etc. Rather than keeping things on Carney's comfortable terrain, which would be kind of abstract technical debates about economics. And that requires political movements that can say, we want real politics again. We want politics that is about groups who have different ideas of the good, different interests, debating one another, fighting one another over what should happen next, rather than an economist coming in and tell us, this is what we'll do because it will be good for all of you.
So I think we are a little short on time. I believe we have a hard stop around about 7:30, but it would be good to get a few questions in.
Yeah, we'll take a few questions and then have Grace answer them. So if folks want to put their hands up.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace. That was very insightful. I really appreciated your reference to the etymology of fascism and the use of the metal rods. But there's a slight asterisk that I would add to that, which is that the etymology is even earlier, and it's in the root word from Latin, which is fascinum, which is, and I kid you not, this is true, the name for a small model of an erection that Roman elite males would wear around their necks on a necklace as a symbol of their manhood. And the question that I have for you there is, I think that there's always been an intrinsic intertwinement between fascism and hegemonic masculinity, and you really see this today with the polarization of political opinion along gender lines. Like the 2024 election would not have happened without the online manosphere, but then also that phenomenon is not, it's not new, because you also see this, the economic gains of second wave feminism happening at the same time as the decline of industrialism and the offshoring and outsourcing and all this kind of stuff. And I think what's happening now is that patriarchy provides a sort of collective we for a particular group of people that's very ancient and older than capitalism, which is the identification as dominant males. And so I wonder what you would have to say about our prospect of creating a collective we that's even more powerful than something that's that old and that strong.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I've thought about this a lot. I think it links to what I was saying in my lecture about responses to powerlessness. Now, you spoke about the idea of masculinity as something that is inherently tied to a particular perception of strength, and not just strength, but also authority. That today has really come up against the fact that a lot of men, most men, exist with this sense of powerlessness, basically, living in an economy in which they have very little control over the conditions of their existence, over their wages, in which they are struggling to be providers, and in which their sense of agency is really restricted by this combination of inequality and individualism. And that kind of confrontation between the ideal of masculinity as strength and the reality of life as a worker in a capitalist economy, which means if you are not participating in collective institutions, it means weakness, right? That is a very, very potent mix. But what I would say is that the response to that, the traditional response to that amongst the labor movement, was to create those forms of belonging and collective power that gave you back that sense of agency, that gave you back that sense of strength through the labor movement, through social movements, and through political movements. Now, ultimately, that narrative that you discussed, this kind of online manosphere narrative, it is very seductive and it's very compelling for a lot of people. But it is obviously a dead end. And the left has to be able to show that. It has to be able to show that, the only real way to reclaim your sense of power and agency, whatever your gender, is to participate in forms of collective action that allow you to resist your exploitation, your oppression, that allow you to resist the authority that is exerted over you by your boss, by politicians, by, the ruling class, basically. And I do think that is kind of a message that has been lost, partly because of that kind of Keynesian takeover of left politics, which is to say, give us, the left political party, power and we'll manage the economy in your favor. I don't think that's enough. I think we need to be saying, actually, the left politics is about empowering you to take control over your life in the workplace, over your life in the community, and that being as part of collective movements that facilitate all of our participation and really help to recover our sense of agency in an economy that seeks to deprive us all of that.
Okay, 2 more questions I guess we have time for. I think there's a gentleman up here who wants to ask a question.
And that question of why do they hate us so much is, I think, linked to what happens and the dehumanization that occurs when you take this market-based approach to understanding society. It's kind of like that Hayek quote of, freedom of thought will only be of relevance to a small minority. Because when you enforce this idea of market forces kind of sorting people into more and less valuable groups, it is inherently dehumanizing. We know that we don't really live in a kind of efficient market economy that, genuinely sorts the most worthy from the least worthy. Otherwise, like, Elon Musk wouldn't be in charge of the US federal government, and we wouldn't have working class women literally fighting to survive in the way that you've just mentioned. But you have to believe that for the system to function. You have to internalize the idea that your place in the hierarchy is a result of your value, rather than a result of decisions that have been made by someone else. That's critically important to the legitimacy of this system. So if you are a working class woman living on benefits or a homeless person, you have to believe, I'm here because I deserve it. And on the other side of that, if you are an elite in charge of political decision making, you also have to believe, I am here because I deserve it. Historically speaking, if we think about like the English ruling class, they would have said, we deserve to be in power because we were born into families who have ruled for generations. That way of thinking has changed slightly to, we deserve to be in power because we live in a market economy that sorts the worthy from the unworthy, and we have all the trappings of success. We have wealth, we have power, we have influence. So that must mean, by this circular form of reasoning, that we deserve it. And equally, those who we treat with disdain and cruelty are seen to deserve that because they have not fought effectively to kind of get to the top of this system. So, the cruelty is part of the point. Because as soon as you stop believing that, as soon as you say, actually, no, the reason that I'm not paid enough to be able to afford my rent is because I live in a rigged economy in which those at the top have made decisions to devalue my work and to deprive me of the things that I need to survive, that is the foundation of rebellion. But if you internalize the sense that you aren't paid enough to survive because you're worthless, that will only lead to kind of despair and acceptance. So really challenging that cruelty that you've just described in a way that I think that you obviously did is so important, not just to like protecting people's humanity, but to challenging capitalism.
Well, I think we are going to have to leave it there, regrettably. A round of applause for Grace. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. We have refreshments in the back, and until 8 o'clock, we have our reception social for the event. Thank you very much for coming, and if you follow Broadbent Institute on all our socials, we'll have the edited clips, we'll have the lecture itself,